Good evening, my friends, and welcome back to another quiet journey into the forgotten corners of history. A place where the past creaks open like the heavy wooden door of an old frontier cabin, settling under the weight of winter, inviting us to step inside, settle down, breathe slowly, and let the story carry us gently towards sleep. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight, maybe even what the weather is like outside your window. And if you enjoy these night-long stories, tap that like button and subscribe. It helps the channel more than any American subsistence farmer in 1712 could have imagined, while arguing with his own goat over who deserved the warm spot closest to the fire. And speaking of them, you should know that early colonial farmers had their own simple jokes, often whispered at the dim glow of a tallow candle. One of the favorites went something like this. If you survive the winter, God must have a plan for you. If not, well, at least you won't have to chop firewood anymore. It wasn't much, but in a world where the wind pushed through every wall and every breath in the morning felt like swallowing ice, even a small joke could feel like a blanket. And so tonight, we drift back to the deadly winter of 1712, a season so cold that even the old men who had crossed the Atlantic swore they had never felt anything like it. A winter where American subsistence farmers, men, women, and children who grew barely enough food to survive, were forced to learn how to sleep through nights that threatened to steal the warmth straight from their bones, nights where frost crept into the corners of the room like a living thing, and where the simple act of making it until dawn felt like a quiet victory. Let sex begin, slowly, with how these families prepared for a night that could kill them if they made even one mistake. They began each evening with a routine that was less a choice and more a ritual carved into their muscles by necessity. A sequence of slow, deliberate movements that started long before darkness fell, because in 1712 you did not wait for the night to prepare for the cold. You raced against it. You tried to stay ahead of it, knowing that once the sun dipped behind the bare trees and the world turned blue and still, the cold gained a kind of intelligence, slipping through cracks you hadn't noticed in daylight, pooling in the corners of the cabin like invisible water and rising up from the dirt floor in silent waves. As the last light faded, the family gathered around what little fire they could afford to burn, the flames small and uneven because chopping wood was back-breaking work, and trees did not split as easily when the sap inside them had frozen solid, so every log was precious and every spark was treated like a piece of gold, and you could feel the tension in the room as they judged how much wood to use tonight, and how much to save for the next night, and the next, because winter did not care if your supplies were low. Winter kept coming anyway. The cabin itself was a simple thing, built not out of luxury but out of whatever the land allowed. Rough-hewn logs stacked tight but never perfectly sealed, chinked with mud, moss, clay, or anything that could be pushed into the cracks. Yet even the best cabins leaked cold the way a cracked jug leaks water, so families learned to live inside a small island of warmth surrounded by a sea of freezing air, clinging to the space close to the hearth as if it were a lifeboat in a storm. And when bedtime came, it wasn't a peaceful moment but a strategic one, because sleeping through the cold was as much about planning as it was about endurance. Parents checked the walls for drafts, stuffed old rags into gaps, dragged heavy animal hides across the floor, and pushed the beds, if they even had beds, as close to the fire as safety allowed, often ending up in a cramped semicircle around the last glowing coals, their bodies arranged not for comfort but for survival. Most families slept in what they called a winter nest, a tight bundle of bodies and blankets and furs, where heat could be shared like a single resource. And it wasn't unusual for 3 or 4 children to sleep in one narrow bed, curled together like a litter of cold, exhausted animals, while the parents lay nearby, forming a protective barrier against the draft that crept under the door. And even the family dog or the goat, the same goat that fought for warmth all day, was sometimes allowed inside, because in a winter like 1712 warmth was warmth, and pride didn't keep anyone alive. And as they lay there, night after night, listening to the wind scrape against the wooden walls like a dull knife, feeling the cold press against their backs even through the blankets. They developed a strange skill, the ability to fall asleep slowly, cautiously, without letting the body fully relax, because they needed to wake up when the fire dipped too low or when the coals began to fade, and someone, usually the father though sometimes the eldest child, had to rise quietly, half frozen, to add one more log, just enough to keep the room from turning into an icebox by dawn. They dressed for sleep with a care that might seem strange today, piling on layers in a way that felt less like preparing for rest and more like preparing for battle. Because in the winter of 1712 you did not slip under the blankets in a nightshirt. You armoured yourself against the darkness, starting with wool, if you were lucky enough to have it, or with coarse linen shirts stiffened by many washings, pulling on stockings that never seemed to dry completely, wrapping scarves around necks, and sometimes even sleeping with mittens, all because the cold had a way of finding every exposed inch of skin and biting down hard. Most families wore the same clothes day and night, not because they wanted to, but because changing into something clean meant letting the warmth escape for those few dangerous minutes, when your breath turned to frost inside the cabin. So it was common to simply keep everything on: shirts, trousers, petticoats, aprons, caps, building a cocoon of fabric around the body until you could barely tell where one layer ended and the next began. And the feeling of sinking into bed with all that weight was less like drifting into sleep and more like sinking under a heavy blanket of exhaustion. Food played its part as well, because a warm body was easier to keep warm, and so before bedtime they ate whatever they could spare, usually something simple, like a small bowl of porridge, a piece of coarse bread softened in hot broth, or a handful of dried apples boiled until they were just soft enough to chew. And even though it wasn't much, the warmth from the food spread slowly through them, giving their bodies a small fighting chance against the long hours ahead. And sometimes, after the last mouthfuls were finished and the fire was coaxed into one final bright moment before being left to fade into embers, they drank small sips of something hot, often just water heated over the flame, but occasionally a weak beer or a broth made from bones that had already been boiled 3 or 4 times, because anything warm, anything that made the breath rise in gentle clouds, felt like a kind of protection. There were tricks too. Little survival habits passed from mother to daughter, father to son, neighbour to neighbour, whispered like secrets learned from the land itself. Some families heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth before tucking them under the blankets, turning them into makeshift hot water bottles that lost their warmth slowly through the night, while others slept on beds stuffed not with feathers, too expensive, but with straw or dried leaves that acted as rough but effective insulation, rustling softly whenever someone moved in the darkness. And as the night deepened and the cold tightened its grip, the firelight shrinking until only a faint orange glow pulsed from the hearth, the family tried to breathe slowly, evenly, because even breath carried heat away, and many learned to tuck their faces under blankets, or tuck the blankets around their noses, creating tiny pockets of warm air where sleep could settle without fear. Outside, the world was silent except for the groaning of trees under the weight of ice and the distant cry of something wild moving through the snow. But inside the cabin, wrapped in layers of fabric and instinct, they clung to one another and drifted into the kind of shallow sleep that wasn't quite restful and wasn't quite safe, a sleep that balanced on the edge of survival, ready to break at the smallest change in the cold. In the middle of the night, when the fire had shrunk to a faint cluster of red coals, and the cabin seemed to inhale and exhale with the wind, someone always had to wake, though no one ever knew exactly when it would happen, because the cold itself acted as an alarm clock, sliding across the floorboards and creeping up the legs of the bed until it reached the skin, where it bloomed into a sharp ache that pulled the sleeper back into the world, just enough to understand that the fire needed tending. It was usually the father who stirred first, rising slowly from the nest of blankets, with a stiffness that made every joint crack like breaking twigs. But in many families it was the eldest child who took on the duty, slipping from the warmth with a mix of pride and dread, knowing they were keeping their siblings alive by stepping into the icy air. They moved through the cabin carefully, trying not to disturb the others, and the moment their feet touched the cold floorboards, it felt as though the winter outside had seeped straight into their bones, sending a shiver up the spine so intense that their teeth chattered before they could stop it. Yet they pressed on, kneeling by the hearth, blowing gently on the coals and arranging dry twigs in a small, precise way that they had practiced countless times, until the orange glow brightened and the first thin flames began to rise again like a small, fragile hope. Often the animals in the cabin stirred too. A dog, lifting its head from where it slept, curled tightly at the foot of the bed, or the family goat shifting in the corner where it had been allowed to stay for warmth, its breath rising in white clouds that drifted toward the ceiling. Even the animals seemed to understand the stakes of the moment, watching the human figure by the fire with quiet, motionless eyes, waiting for the warmth to return before settling down again. Sometimes the person feeding the fire paused in silence, listening to the eerie noises outside, the cracking of frozen branches, the faint howl of the wind pushing against the walls, the distant echo of something moving through the trees. And in those moments the cabin felt incredibly small, a fragile wooden shell keeping the winter at bay, and they understood just how thin the line between survival and disaster really was. Once the flames grew stronger, and the warmth began to spread outward again, the watcher would return to the nest of sleeping bodies, slipping back under the blankets with a sigh that was half relief, half exhaustion, curling into the same tightly held position as before, knees tucked to chest, arms wrapped around their own body, chin buried in the fabric, and letting the heat slowly seep back into their skin, fighting off the numbness that had already begun to creep in. But the most dangerous hours were not midnight. They were the long, slow hours just before dawn, when the cold reached its peak and the night seemed to stretch endlessly, pressing down on the cabin like a physical weight, and even the strongest fires struggled to maintain their heat. It was during these hours that many families suffered the most, when fingers and toes went numb, when breath turned sharp and shallow, and when even a moment of carelessness, a fire that burned too low, a draft that slipped through an unsealed crack, could tip the balance toward danger. And yet, somehow they endured, drifting in and out of shallow sleep, clinging to one another for warmth, murmuring soft prayers they barely remembered from church, waiting for the first faint light to appear through the small frost-glazed window, because dawn did not just mean morning, it meant survival. It meant that they had made it through one more night, and that the world, despite all its cold cruelty, still allowed them another day on the land. Morning came slowly in those winters, not with the warm promise of sunlight, but with a pale, silvery glow that seeped through the frost-covered window like a hesitant visitor. And before anyone even opened their eyes, the first thing they felt was the stiffness of cold that had settled into their joints during the night, making it difficult to stretch, difficult to move, difficult even to breathe without feeling the icy air scratch against the inside of the lungs. The fire, despite the midnight tending, had once again faded to a low cluster of embers, and as the family stirred one by one, they did not wake with the relaxed comfort we know today. They woke like people pulling themselves out of a frozen cave, groaning softly as they unfolded their bodies and reached for their clothing layers, checking quickly to make sure no one's fingers or toes had turned dangerously numb. The parents were the first to rise fully, rubbing their hands briskly together to force blood back into the skin, their breath puffing in ghostly clouds as they moved around the cabin, shaking off the thin dusting of frost that had formed on the inside of the walls overnight, a reminder that even their shelter had frozen while they slept. The father knelt by the hearth once more, stirring the coals and adding carefully chosen pieces of dry wood, leaning close to blow life into the fire until the flames rose and spread a gentle warmth across the room. This warmth was never enough to heat the cabin entirely, but it was enough to thaw fingers and soften the ache in their bones. The mother, meanwhile, tended to the children, gently massaging their cold hands, helping them pull on their layers, and checking their faces for the telltale pale patches of early frostbite. Because in that winter, every small injury could turn dangerous quickly, and every routine began with making sure no one had been harmed by the night. She would prepare a small breakfast next, usually something simple and modest, like a bit of cornmeal mush reheated from the night before, or a slice of bread warmed by being held near the fire, and the children ate it gratefully, not because it tasted good, but because it filled them with a faint internal warmth that made facing the day bearable. After eating, the real work began, because frontier life did not pause for cold or exhaustion. The cabin needed constant reinforcement in winter, and every morning the family inspected the damage the night had done. The father examined the walls for cracks widened by expanding ice, pushing more moss or clay into them with numb fingertips, patching the cabin like a wounded animal that needed constant tending. The mother shook out the bedding and hung the damp blankets near the fire, hoping to chase out at least some of the night's moisture before they froze again. The children swept the floor, collected snow that had blown in under the door, and carried out the ashes from the hearth to make room for the day's fire. Even the smoke rising from the chimney was a kind of ritual, a column of grey drifting into the pale morning sky, signalling to any neighbours within walking distance that the family had survived the night, that life continued in this small cabin on the edge of a vast, unforgiving wilderness. And sometimes, if the cold wasn't too severe, a nearby farmer or two would appear at the doorway with a small offering, a handful of dried beans, a piece of salt pork, a few sticks of extra firewood, because in winters like the one in 1712, people understood that no family survived alone, and sharing was not charity but necessity. Yet even with these morning routines, with the fire restored, with the chores underway, the cabin never fully warmed. Instead, it held a thin layer of tolerable cold, a fragile balance between comfort and harshness, and the family carried that cold with them throughout the day, knowing it would return with full force once the sun dipped low again and another long night approached. Their days were shaped by the cold as surely as their nights were, and from the moment the pale morning light spread across the snow-covered clearing, they moved with a sense of deliberate urgency, understanding that every hour of daylight was a small gift from a season that offered very few. The father often stepped outside first, pushing open the cabin door with a grunt as a wave of sharp, biting air rushed in, filling the room with a cold so powerful it felt almost solid, and for a moment he simply stood there, squinting at the white world around him, gauging the weather, listening to the creak of distant trees, trying to read what the day intended to bring. Chopping wood was the first and most crucial chore, because no matter how much wood they had gathered before winter began, it never seemed enough, and the winter of 1712 was especially unforgiving, freezing the sap inside the logs so deeply that the wood split unpredictably, sending shards flying and forcing him to work slowly, cautiously, with raw hands wrapped in stiff leather gloves. Each piece of wood he split was precious, a small fragment of survival, and he stacked them carefully under what shelter he could build, a crude lean-to made from branches and bark, just enough to keep the worst of the snow off, because dry wood was life, and wet wood was smoke, and smoke without heat was death. Inside, the mother busied herself with the endless task of keeping the cabin livable, a duty that felt less like housekeeping and more like waging a quiet, constant war against cold and decay. She boiled water when she could spare the fuel, melting snow in a heavy iron pot hung above the fire, and used it to wash clothes stiffened by frost, to soften the children's worn mittens, to wipe down their faces so the windburn wouldn't crack their skin. She patched torn clothing using whatever scraps she could salvage, pushing a rough needle through heavy wool with hands that trembled from cold, and every repair she made was done with the knowledge that a rip left unattended would only widen during the next night's shivering. The children had their own responsibilities, though they were young, and in those frontier winters childhood was a brief, fragile thing. The older ones helped gather kindling, picking through the forest floor for twigs dry enough to use, brushing away snow to find pieces sheltered beneath fallen branches, while the younger ones fed the goats or coaxed the chickens into moving, their small hands cupped around the birds to warm them just enough to keep them alive. Even play in that season was quiet. Children did not run far from the cabin or shout loudly in the snow because their steps needed to be careful, and the cold stole breath too quickly for shouting to feel joyful. By midday the sun hung low but bright, casting long shadows across the frozen fields, and if the weather allowed, families sometimes gathered what little food still remained in their storage pits. Shriveled potatoes, strings of dried corn, root vegetables kept in earthen crocks beneath layers of straw, checking for signs of rot, rationing carefully, knowing that misjudging their supplies even once could cost them dearly before spring. They prepared a simple midday meal, barely more than a warm drink or a thin stew, but each warm swallow strengthened them just enough to continue, giving them the energy to push through the biting wind when chores called them outside again. And always woven through every task was the awareness that afternoon drifted quickly toward evening, that the cold seemed to grow heavier as the sun descended, and that the cabin would need to be readied once more for the long, punishing night. They checked the chinking in the walls, pressing more moss into any new gaps. They brushed snow from the roof to prevent it from collapsing under accumulated weight. They gathered the animals closer to the cabin, and they brought in the last load of wood, stacking it near the hearth where it would dry just enough to burn bright through the first hours of darkness. And as the day faded into a quiet, blue-tinted twilight, the family reunited inside the cabin, pulling the shutters closed, lowering the simple wooden bar that served as their lock, and beginning again the slow, careful ritual that would determine whether they slept in comfort or in fear. As evening settled in, the world outside the cabin shifted into a deeper shade of blue, the kind that seemed to swallow the horizon and press down on the earth with a heavy, suffocating stillness. And for the subsistence farmers of 1712, this twilight was the quiet signal that the true test of endurance was about to begin again. The family moved more slowly now, not because they were tired, though they were, but because every movement felt deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if they were preparing to enter a long, cold vigil rather than a night of rest. The father brought in the last armful of wood, shaking off the ice that clung to the bark, while the mother closed the shutters tightly, securing them with rough wooden pegs that rattled when the wind grew strong, and the children gathered their blankets and worn furs near the hearth, building their little island of warmth before the cold could invade. The fire was fed with a careful hand, logs placed in a way that allowed them to burn slowly and steadily, the flames rising for a moment in a golden burst of light that filled the cabin with a warm glow, casting long shadows on the walls and making the frost crystals glitter like tiny stars. This was the moment when the cabin felt almost safe, almost comfortable, and the family usually paused for a breath, letting the warmth sink into their bones while they spoke softly about the day or murmured small prayers of gratitude, not for abundance because they had none, but for survival, which in that winter was the greatest blessing they could ask for. But the comfort never lasted long, because as the night approached fully, the temperature dipped sharply, and the cold began pressing against the cabin with a relentless determination, sliding under the door, seeping through the floor, and settling on every surface like a thin, invisible frost. The father checked the chinking one last time, running his hand along the wall to feel where the draft pushed hardest, and stuffed extra moss into the gaps, while his breath thickened in the air. The mother placed a heavy hide over the door to block the worst of the wind, pushing the edges tight against the floor with logs or stones, and the children helped by gathering their few possessions away from the walls, because anything left too close to the cold might freeze during the night. Once the preparations were complete, the family ate their modest evening meal, a thin broth perhaps, or porridge reheated from the morning, sitting close to the fire where the warmth could touch their hands and faces. And though the meal was simple, this moment felt strangely intimate, like a final gathering before stepping into a storm. They spoke little now, conserving their breath and their energy, and as the fire burned lower, and the flames softened into a warm orange glow, the room seemed to shrink, the walls drawing closer as if sheltering them, wrapping them in a fragile sense of protection that everyone in the cabin understood could break at any moment if they did not remain vigilant. The children, exhausted from the day's chores and the constant battle against the cold, curled themselves into tight bundles, pulling the blankets over their heads until only the faintest movement of breath betrayed their presence. The mother added one more layer of hide to the sleeping area, smoothing it over the children with gentle hands, making sure no gap remained for the cold to slip through, while the father prepared the fire for the first long stretch of the night, arranging the remaining logs in a careful stack designed to burn slowly, giving the family enough warmth to fall into the first fragile stage of sleep. And as the darkness finally swallowed the cabin, leaving only the rhythmic crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the winter wind, they took one last look around the room, each silently acknowledging the unspoken truth that the night would test them again, that the cold would probe the cabin for weaknesses, and that survival depended not on comfort but on vigilance, on instinct, and on the small rituals passed down through generations of families who had learned to respect winter as both an enemy and a teacher. In the first hours of the night, the cabin became a world unto itself, a tiny bubble of flickering warmth, surrounded on all sides by an ocean of cold so vast and silent that it seemed to swallow every sound before it reached the trees. And as the fire settled into a low, steady burn, the air inside the room began to change, growing heavier, slower, filled with the soft rhythm of breathing layered one over another like the gentle movement of waves. The family huddled close in their winter nest, drawing together with an instinct older than memory, arranging their bodies so that every inch of warmth could be shared, because in the winter of 1712 survival was collective, and no one, not even the strongest, could face the cold alone. The children curled toward the center, their small bodies radiating a faint heat that the parents shielded with their own, forming a protective ring that blocked the drafts creeping along the floor, drafts so thin and sharp they felt like icy fingers sliding beneath the blankets, tightening around ankles and wrists whenever someone shifted. The mother positioned herself where the cold was worst, near the seam in the wall where the moss never quite stayed in place, her back pressed against the rough wood as she absorbed the chill in silence, while the father lay closest to the fire, not for comfort but because he needed to rise first when the flames dimmed, and his place by the hearth allowed him to sense the drop in temperature almost instantly. As they began to drift into sleep, the cold reached for them again, moving slowly, as if testing their defenses, and their breaths turned shallow and faint, rising in soft clouds that hung in the air for a moment, before dissolving into the darkness. Their faces tightened reflexively, eyelids twitching against the occasional gust that slipped beneath the door, and their hands, clasped tightly against their chests or tucked into the folds of blankets, stiffened when the cold touched them. Yet they did not wake fully. Instead, they hovered in a fragile, dreamlike state, half aware of the room around them, half lost in the fog of exhaustion that winter imposed on every living thing. The fire crackled softly, sending up brief sparks that glowed orange for a moment before vanishing, and each spark lit the cabin just enough to reveal the shapes of the sleeping family, shoulders rising slowly with each breath, silhouettes merging under layers of wool and hide, faces peaceful but tense, as if holding on to warmth with thought alone. The oldest child often woke first in these early hours, not from sound but from a sudden stillness in the air, a shift so subtle only experience could detect it, and they would open their eyes to see the fire dimming, the shadows stretching farther across the room, the cold beginning to thicken like a fog rolling in from the corners. Slowly, without disturbing the others, the child would crawl toward the hearth, teeth already chattering before they reached it, and with trembling hands they placed one of the smaller pieces of wood onto the fading coals, watching carefully as the flame hesitated, flickered, then caught again, sending a faint warmth back into the cabin. This task, though small, carried a weight that they understood deeply. The difference between fire and embers could be the difference between waking up or not waking at all. and the quiet responsibility humbled them even at a young age. Once the flame revived, they crawled back into the nest, burrowing into the warmth their family had conserved, and the others instinctively shifted to make room, their half-conscious bodies recognizing the return of familiar heat. The night deepened, the wind grew harsher, and the cold became almost a presence, not just a temperature but a force, pressing against the cabin like a vast invisible creature, hunting for any weakness, any opportunity to slip inside. Still, the family slept on, bound together in a fragile cocoon of breath and warmth and instinct, drifting through the first long stretch of darkness with a kind of quiet bravery that no one talked about, because in 1712 it wasn't called bravery, it was simply life. As midnight approached, the cold reached a depth that felt almost supernatural, a kind of ancient, bone-deep chill that seemed to seep out of the very earth beneath the cabin, rising slowly through the floorboards until it wrapped itself around the sleeping family like a heavy, invisible shroud. The fire, despite careful tending, burned lower than before, its flames softening into dull embers that pulsed gently in the darkness, and the cabin felt as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the next gust of wind to rattle the shutters or slip through the narrow gaps that no amount of moss or clay could keep fully sealed. In those hours, the cold was not simply an enemy outside, it was a presence inside, a silent intruder that moved from corner to corner, testing the defenses the family had built with their blankets and bodies. The human body, pushed to its limits, began to react in ways that were both protective and painful, muscles tightening involuntarily, shoulders rising toward the ears, as if trying to shield vital organs from the creeping frost, legs pulling closer to the chest in the instinctive posture of self-preservation that children and elders alike adopted without thinking, and the steady rhythm of breathing, shifting slightly as the cold air pricked the tips of their noses and lips. Sometimes the children mumbled in their sleep, their voices low and wavering, as if dreaming of warmth or calling out to the fire for help, and the parents, even in their half-conscious state, tightened their embrace, drawing them closer, creating a tighter seal against the cold. This was the hour when the cabin's weaknesses became most obvious, when the wind outside rose in sudden violent bursts that made the walls groan and the door tremble on its hinges, and a thin veil of frost began forming on the inside of the window panes, delicate patterns appearing as if painted by the hand of winter itself. The father, sensing the danger even in sleep, often woke with a start, his breath catching as he realized how quickly the fire had weakened, and without hesitation he pushed himself from the warm nest, grimacing as the freezing air slapped against his skin like a punishment. He moved quickly but carefully, stepping across the creaking boards, each footfall sending up a faint puff of frost that drifted around his ankles, and knelt before the embers, cupping his hands around them to shield the last fragile glow from the draught. With practiced ease he added a log, then a second, arranging them so they would catch slowly and burn for hours, and as the flames rose once more, he let out a quiet sigh, not of relief, but of acknowledgement, because he knew this battle would repeat itself again before morning came. Some families, especially those who had lived through several hard winters, had developed their own quiet techniques to fight the cold, tricks learned through experience and necessity. They heated small stones in the fire, wrapping them tightly in cloth, before placing them under the blankets near the children's feet, creating pockets of warmth that lasted long enough to carry them through the worst of the night. Others filled cloth bags with warm ashes, a dangerous but effective method, and tucked them close to their bodies, using the retained heat to stave off the creeping numbness that could turn deadly if ignored. And a few even slept with their animals inside the cabin, allowing dogs, goats, or even the occasional chicken to nestle among them, because in those bitter hours warmth was warmth, no matter the source. But even with these methods, even with centuries of instinct guiding their movements, midnight remained the most brutal threshold of winter, the moment when exhaustion and cold strained the body and mind in equal measure. The cabin walls would pop and creak as the logs contracted in the freezing air, the sound echoing in the darkness like distant footsteps, and every member of the family, even the youngest child, learned to distinguish between normal nighttime noises and the sharp, sudden crack that meant the frost had opened a new gap somewhere in the wall. Still, they pressed through those hours with a determination born from necessity, returning again and again to the same tight, protective huddle, sharing warmth with quiet desperation, drifting in and out of shallow sleep while the night stretched around them, a long, icy corridor with no clear end in sight. In the final hours before dawn, when the world was at its absolute coldest, and the sky outside the cabin dissolved into a black so deep it seemed to swallow even the memory of light, the family faced the most dangerous stretch of the night, a period when exhaustion, cold, and silence fused into a single suffocating weight, pressing down on every sleeping body. These were the hours when the fire, despite all earlier efforts, always seemed to shrink again, the flames collapsing inward until only a faint red glow remained beneath the ash, and the warmth that had lingered in the cabin just after midnight drained away inch by inch, leaving the room filled with a stillness sharp enough to sting the skin. The cold, having spent the entire night searching for weaknesses, grew bold now, slipping across the floor in slow, creeping waves that wrapped around ankles and knees like icy ropes, tightening their grip each time someone shifted under the blankets. Even the breath of the sleeping family changed, turning into thin, trembling wisps that hovered in the air before fading into the darkness, and their bodies curled deeper into themselves, arms drawn tight across chests, shoulders hunched forward, as if trying to shield the lungs from the freezing air that scraped against their throats with each inhale. The father, utterly depleted from the earlier wakings, often slept too deeply during these hours to notice the fire fading, and so it was the mother who stirred next, her instincts sharper, her sleep lighter, her body responding to the cold with a kind of quiet, immediate awareness born from years of caring for children through winter nights. She would open her eyes slowly, her lashes already stiff with frost, and listen to the silence, a silence so heavy it felt unnatural, a silence that told her the fire was nearly gone. The moment she pushed back the blankets, the cold attacked her skin like needles, forcing a gasp from her lips. But she did not pause. She moved straight to the hearth, crossing the floor with small tight steps, her bare feet wincing at the burn of the frozen boards. At the hearth she knelt, blowing softly into the pale embers, coaxing them back to life with the same tenderness she used to soothe a frightened child. And when the faint glow brightened, she added twigs one by one, careful not to overwhelm the fire with cold, heavy logs that might snuff it out entirely. Only when the first small flame flickered upward did she allow herself a quiet exhale, and though the warmth was barely noticeable, it was enough to push back the cold for another hour, enough to keep the family safe until sunrise. The children, still sleeping, reacted to the restored heat in their own subtle ways. Their legs, drawn tightly to their chests moments earlier, loosened slightly, and their hands relaxed from the fists they had formed unconsciously in the cold. One child might roll closer to a sibling, seeking instinctively the warmth of another body, while the youngest often buried their face deeper into the blankets, chasing the faint pocket of warm air their own breath had created through the night. Yet even with the fire revived, the pre-dawn hours remained a test of endurance few modern people can imagine. This was the time when tremors began, not from fear, but from the body's automatic response to cold so intense that the muscles shook on their own, trying desperately to generate heat. The shivering could be so violent it rattled the beds, waking the older children or causing the wooden frame to creak under the strain, and for a moment the entire cabin seemed to tremble with them, as though reacting to the cold in solidarity. Outside, the world was brutally still. The animals huddled in makeshift shelters, their breaths forming frozen halos around their muzzles. The trees stood rigid and silent, their branches encased in glassy layers of ice, and even the wind, so loud earlier in the night, seemed to hold itself back, waiting. These last hours before dawn always felt strangely suspended, as if time itself slowed under the weight of the cold, stretching the night into something fragile and endless. But inside that tiny cabin, wrapped in blankets, pressed close together, breathing in soft, shallow rhythms, the family endured. They endured because they had no other choice. They endured because generations before them had endured the same hours. They endured because the first light of dawn, faint, cold, almost colourless, would eventually appear, and with it the thin promise of warmth, of movement, of another day. When dawn finally arrived, it did not burst into the cabin with warmth or brightness the way we imagine mornings today. Instead, it crept in slowly, cautiously, as if unsure whether it was truly welcome in a world still held tightly in winter's grip. The first light was pale and cold, a thin strip of silver that slipped through the frost-coated window pane and stretched across the floorboards like a delicate thread, illuminating the room in such a soft, distant way that for a moment the family wasn't certain whether they were waking to day or to another layer of night. But as that faint light grew, spreading upward along the cabin walls and touching the sleeping faces beneath the blankets, the family stirred, not with the relaxed ease of people waking from restorative sleep, but with the stiff, slow movements of bodies that had spent the night curled into knots, muscles rigid from shivering, joints swollen from cold, and breath still shallow from hours of carefully conserving every bit of warmth they could. The children blinked first, their lashes dusted with tiny crystals of frost, their cheeks flushed with the dull red of cold, and for a moment they remained still, listening to the low crackle of the revived fire and feeling the faint warmth drift toward them like a promise. The father woke next, groaning softly as he stretched, the sound low and muffled beneath the heavy blankets. His first instinct was always the same, to look toward the hearth, to judge the strength of the fire, to make sure the cabin had not dipped into the kind of cold that could leave someone dangerously numb. When he saw the small but steady flame dancing behind the drift of ash, a wave of quiet relief washed over him, so subtle it barely reached his expression, but unmistakable to anyone who had lived through a winter like this. They had made it through another night. Nothing more, nothing less, but in 1712, that alone was a victory. The mother slowly sat up, rubbing her hands together beneath the folds of her shawl, feeling the sting of returning blood in her fingers, a sensation both painful and reassuring. She glanced toward each child, her eyes softening as she saw movement, breath, color, signs of life she never took for granted in winters like this. She whispered a few comforting words, not to wake them fully, but to anchor them gently in the new day, her voice low and smooth like warm cloth. As they rose from their shared winter nest, the blankets fell away, releasing little clouds of trapped warmth that vanished almost instantly into the cold air. The floorboards were cold enough to burn their bare feet, forcing them to move quickly toward the fire, clutching their clothing layers around their bodies while the chill wrapped itself around their ankles like icy vines. The cabin, though dimly lit by dawn, still felt heavy with the memory of the night. Every surface cold to the touch, every corner coated with a thin powder of frost, every breath forming a pale mist that drifted upward toward the rafters. The father added more wood to the fire, this time larger pieces that could burn boldly through the morning, and as the flames caught and brightened, the room warmed by tiny increments, enough to soften the stiffness in their limbs and restore feeling to fingers that had grown dangerously numb. The mother began preparing a small morning meal, melting snow in the iron pot, and adding the last handful of grain or dried fruit she could spare, stirring slowly while the children gathered around her, hands outstretched to feel the warmth coming off the pot. Even the animals reacted to the dawn, the goat bleating softly from its corner, as if announcing its own survival, the dog thumping its tail weakly against the floor, rising stiffly to stretch before pressing itself close to the fire. In those moments the cabin felt alive again, fragile, still cold, still vulnerable, but undeniably alive. And as the light grew stronger, touching the tops of the surrounding trees with a faint, icy gold. The family prepared for the routine that waited outside: the work, the hardship, the unending cycle of gathering wood, tending the animals, walking through snow that swallowed their boots, repairing the cabin's chinking, rationing each scrap of food, and preparing once more for the night that would inevitably come again. Because in that winter no day was easy, but every day meant another chance to endure, another chance to push back against the cold, another chance to hold their family together in a world where warmth was rare, hard-earned, and precious beyond measure. The day that followed a night like that carried its own quiet weight, because even though the sun had finally risen and the long oppressive darkness had lifted, the cold still ruled the land with the same merciless authority, and every hour demanded its own kind of endurance. As the family finished their small morning meal, they moved through the cabin with stiff, deliberate motions, feeling the dull ache in their joints left behind by hours spent in cramped positions, muscles sore from shivering, skin burning with the strange, paradoxical sting of rewarming. Stepping outside into the morning light was both a relief and a shock. A relief because the world no longer felt suffocatingly dark. A shock because the air, touched by the faintest trace of sunlight, was still cold enough to bite directly into their bones. The father walked first into the yard, lifting his face slightly toward the sky, as he searched for any hint of a change in the weather, a softer wind, a break in the clouds, even a different smell in the air. Because in 1712 survival depended on reading the smallest signals, and the winter often revealed its intentions long before actual storms arrived. The snow beneath his boots crunched sharply, so brittle and dry from the cold that it sounded like breaking glass, and each step sent a fine spray of powder into the air that sparkled briefly in the morning light before settling again. He began the day's most essential chore, cutting wood. Not with the slow, rhythmic comfort that might accompany such work in milder seasons, but with the determined, almost grim precision of someone who knew exactly how many logs stood between his family and the cold's unforgiving hunger. His breath rose in thick clouds, his fingers numb despite being wrapped in leather, and with every swing of the axe, the shock of the impact traveled up his arms, making his muscles tremble in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with the body fighting against the cold. Inside the cabin, the mother tended to the endless tasks that accumulated overnight, chores that might have seemed small in other seasons, but became monumental in winter. She scraped frost from the inside of the shutters, emptied the ashes from the hearth to make room for a stronger fire later in the day, and set the blankets near the flames so the lingering dampness could evaporate before the next night. She checked the children's clothing for loose seams or holes worn thin by constant rubbing, patching anything that might allow cold to slip in when they ventured outside. Every stitch she made was a small act of protection, a silent promise that she refused to let the winter claim even a fraction more than it already had. The children, though young, were not spared from work. The cold made every task heavier. They fed the animals, breaking through layers of ice to reach the buckets beneath, their small fingers turning red as they coaxed the goat and chickens into eating. They gathered kindling, searching beneath the thick drifts of snow for twigs that had stayed dry under fallen branches. The effort of bending and lifting sending shivers through their thin frames. Even carrying snow into the cabin to melt for water became a challenge, the buckets awkward in their hands, the cold burning against their skin through the metal handle. By midday, the sun sat higher but offered only the illusion of warmth, casting long, shimmering rays across the frozen fields without softening the air in the slightest. The family took a brief moment to eat again, if they had anything to spare, usually a repeat of the morning's thin porridge or broth, warmed once more over the fire. It wasn't a meal for pleasure or comfort. It was fuel, just enough to keep their bodies moving, just enough to prevent the creeping numbness that came from working too long without rest. Even during daylight, the cold carried hidden dangers. Exposed skin froze quickly, sometimes without warning, turning pale and numb before the person noticed anything was wrong. Tools slipped from fingers that grew too stiff to grip. breath condensed into frost around scarves and collars, weighing them down with moisture that chilled even faster once they stepped back outside. And sometimes, without realizing it, fatigue made them careless. A trip over a frozen route, a fall in deep snow, a moment of inattention near the axe, each mistake made more perilous by the cold's ability to drain strength and clarity from the mind. Yet despite the hardships, there was a certain rhythm to the day, a rhythm shaped not by comfort but by necessity, and even the children learned to sense the subtle shift in the air that meant afternoon was fading. The angle of the light grew sharper, the wind more insistent, the shadows longer and bluer, and with those changes came the understanding that they had only a short time left to gather what they needed before the next night began, a night that promised to be no gentler than the one before it. And so, as the sun edged toward the horizon and the cold deepened once more, the family moved quickly but carefully, checking the animals, stacking the last of the wood, pulling the water bucket inside so it wouldn't freeze solid, and securing anything outside that might be lost to the wind. Every task carried the same unspoken urgency. Prepare now, because in a few hours the world would belong again to darkness and frost. As daylight began to thin and the horizon dimmed into that familiar, cold blue haze that always announced the return of evening, a quiet seriousness settled over the cabin and everyone inside it, a heaviness not of fear but of weary acceptance, because they knew exactly what awaited them once darkness fell again. The winter of 1712 did not negotiate, did not relent, did not offer small mercies at the end of a hard day. Instead, it circled back with the same brutal persistence, forcing every family to prepare mentally and physically for another long night where the slightest lapse could cost dearly. And so, as the sun slipped lower, painting the snow with faint streaks of gold that quickly cooled into grey, the family moved through their late afternoon tasks with a calm, practiced urgency, determined to finish everything before the sky darkened completely. The father brought in the last load of wood, his arms trembling from fatigue, his breath thick in the biting air, and he stacked each log near the hearth, with the precision of someone who had learned through experience exactly how many pieces would carry them safely through the night. He paused for a moment, rubbing his sore hands together, watching his breath drift upward like smoke, and then stepped outside one final time to check that the animals were sheltered, nudging the goat deeper into the lean-to, brushing snow from its back, and securing a makeshift barrier against the wind so the creature could at least survive until morning. Inside, the mother began assembling what little food they had for the evening. There was no abundance, no comfort in the meal, but there was purpose, a small bowl of hot broth to push warmth into their bellies, a reheated slice of bread to remind them of strength, a pinch of salt or herbs if they were lucky, each element chosen not for taste but for its ability to keep the body functioning through another night of freezing air. She set the pot over the fire, stirring slowly, watching the steam rise, letting its faint warmth touch her face like a whispered reassurance. The children, sensing the familiar shift in the room's atmosphere, became quieter, their earlier movements slowing as the cold deepened. They rolled up the blankets, shook out the furs, and arranged them carefully in the sleeping area near the hearth, building once more the thick, layered nest that had kept them alive the night before. Their small hands moved with surprising confidence, adjusting edges, smoothing corners, creating a space that felt tight, sheltered, enclosed, a cocoon where warmth could be trapped and guarded through the long hours ahead. As the fire crackled and the last bit of daylight slipped away, the family gathered briefly for their evening meal, sitting close to the flames, hands wrapped around warm cups, the glow illuminating their tired faces. This moment, though simple, was one of the few times each day when they could feel a faint sense of unity, of closeness, of something like peace, because the chores of the day were done, the preparations were complete, and for a short while they allowed themselves to savor the fragile security of a lit cabin before the night reclaimed it. Once the meal was finished, they spoke quietly, not long conversations, but small reassurances exchanged in soft voices. The father might mention that the wind seemed calmer than the night before, The mother might say she felt the air was a little less sharp. The children might whisper about the faint sparks rising from the fire like tiny stars. These moments did not erase the fear of what lay ahead, but they softened it, turning dread into resolve, and fatigue into something closer to courage. Then, one by one, they changed back into their nighttime layers, pulling wool and linen tightly around their bodies, adjusting their scarves and caps, checking each other's clothing for gaps where cold might slip in. The mother wrapped the youngest child in an extra hide, smoothing it gently over their shoulders. The father tucked the blankets more securely near the door. The oldest child placed a warm stone, heated just moments earlier, near the foot of the bed, ensuring that the first shock of cold would not reach their toes as quickly as it had the night before. As darkness finally settled, heavy and silent, the family moved into their sleeping space, lowering themselves into the nest of blankets, drawing close until their bodies touched, forming once again the tight cluster of warmth that had kept them alive through every night so far. The fire had not yet dimmed, and its light stretched across the room in soft, trembling patterns, casting shadows that shifted slowly as the flames danced. In those final minutes before sleep, the mother whispered a soft prayer, not for abundance, not for comfort, but simply for endurance, while the father stretched out one hand toward the fire, gauging its strength, memorizing its warmth, preparing mentally for the moments when he would need to rise again. The children curled closer to each other, eyes heavy, breath slow, their bodies finally relaxing after the long, cold day. And outside, the winter waited, patient and unchanging, pressing against the cabin walls with the same relentless cold that had tested them the night before, a reminder that survival was not a moment but a rhythm, repeated day after day and night after night, a balance between vigilance and hope, exhaustion and persistence. And when the last traces of twilight faded completely, dissolving into a darkness so dense it felt almost physical, the cabin settled into the deep stillness that marked the beginning of every winter night in 1712. Outside, the forest disappeared into blackness, the snow-covered ground reflecting only the faintest suggestion of moonlight, and the world seemed to shrink until nothing remained but the small, fragile sphere of warmth, pressed against the cabin's wooden walls. Inside, the family lay close together, cocooned in their layered nest of blankets and hides, listening silently as the night wrapped itself around the house, the cold beginning its slow, familiar attempt to seep inside once more. In those first hours, sleep did not come quickly, not because they were restless or afraid, but because the transition from day to night required a kind of mental shift, a quiet bracing of the mind, a soft tightening of the spirit, an acknowledgement that they were once again stepping into a long, uncertain darkness, where the fire, the blankets, and their own bodies were the only defenses they possessed. The father lay with his back toward the draftiest wall, letting the cold press against him, so the children could rest in the center of the nest, and he listened closely to every sound, the crack of a distant tree splitting under the weight of frost, the faint howling of wind weaving through the branches, the soft, rhythmic breathing of his family, as warmth pooled between their bodies. The mother, lying on the opposite side, kept one hand resting on the youngest child, feeling the rise and fall of their tiny breaths, an instinctive measure of safety she never allowed herself to skip. Even with the blankets pulled high, and the fire still burning in the hearth, she felt the cold drift across her face, like a thin veil of ice, reminding her of how small their shelter truly was in the vast frozen wilderness. She tightened her shawl around her shoulders, and tucked a stray piece of wool beneath the child's chin, sealing away the last small gap where cold might reach. The children, though exhausted, lay awake for several minutes, adjusting their limbs, searching for the warmest positions, turning their faces toward the center of the nest where heat was strongest. They whispered a few soft words to each other, tiny murmurs lost in the sound of crackling fire, about the warmth of the stone near their feet, or the way the firelight danced across the ceiling beams, or how the snow outside made everything silent. These small exchanges offered comfort, tiny sparks of normalcy in a night that offered little else. As the room grew darker and the fire settled into a more measured burn, the weight of the night fully descended. The cold pressed harder now, searching for cracks, tugging at the seams of the cabin with long, invisible fingers, probing every weakness in the structure. The walls groaned softly, the wood contracting with the temperature drop, and this sound, while familiar, always carried a faint echo of vulnerability, a reminder that their home was nothing more than logs, mud, and willpower holding back a season that seemed intent on swallowing everything. Inside the nest, the first tremors began, small involuntary shivers that passed through the children's bodies like waves, and the parents instinctively responded, pulling the blankets tighter and shifting closer until their bodies formed a tighter seal. The fire's warmth reached them only in gentle pulses now, barely enough to overcome the cold creeping along the floor, and every breath they took felt thick and slow, crystallizing in the air before dissolving into darkness. Though the family rarely spoke during this time, the silence between them was not empty. It was a shared understanding, a quiet communion built from countless nights spent fighting the same enemy, a kind of unspoken language that told them exactly when someone moved, when someone needed warmth, when someone drifted too close to the cold edge of the nest. In the darkness, they were not alone, even when fear brushed against the edges of their thoughts like a cold wind. And slowly, gradually, as the fire held, as the blankets warmed, as their bodies aligned into a single cluster of shared heat, they drifted into the shallow, fragile sleep that winter allowed, a sleep constantly interrupted by small shivers, by soft creaks from the walls, by the father shifting to check the fire, by the mother adjusting a blanket or smoothing a child's hair, but a sleep nonetheless, a surrender not to comfort but to trust. Outside, the night deepened, the temperature continued to fall, and the cold circled the cabin with patient determination, returning to test the walls again and again. But inside, the family held their fragile ground, wrapped in the silent resilience that had carried them through every night so far. As the night stretched deeper, and the cold reached the height of its power, the cabin seemed to shrink even further, its walls tightening as though they too were bracing against the frost that pressed in from every direction, and the darkness outside thickened into something almost tangible, a heavy blackness that absorbed sound and light until it felt as though the entire world had narrowed to this one fragile, flickering room. The wind rose and fell in long, mournful waves, sometimes brushing softly against the roof like a whisper, other times slamming into the door with a force that made the wooden frame tremble. And with each gust, the family stirred subconsciously, their bodies responding to the vibrations with tiny adjustments, tightening their cluster of warmth as though instinctively defending it from an unseen threat. The cold, emboldened by the deep of night, began its final assault. It crept beneath the door, forming a thin line of frost along the floorboards. It slipped through the smallest gaps in the chinking, weaving itself into the air, in swirling drafts that drifted across the room like pale ghosts. It climbed the walls, sinking into the logs, and radiating inward with a slow, penetrating chill that made even the blankets feel thinner. The cabin no longer felt like a solid structure, but like a breathing, living thing, a humble shield shivering under the weight of a winter stronger than wood, stronger than clay, stronger than the warmth of a single family. Inside the nest, the family felt the temperature drop almost immediately, not as a sudden shock, but as a subtle, creeping sensation, a heaviness settling into their bones, a tightening in their muscles, a tremble that began in their fingers and toes and slowly worked its way upward. The children instinctively tucked their knees higher to their chests, curling into small, round shapes that preserved as much body heat as possible, and their soft breaths grew shorter, faster, visible in thin clouds that floated above their faces before dissolving. The father felt it too, the unmistakable warning of extreme cold, the cold that did not simply surround the body but pressed into it, narrowing the space between sleep and danger. With a quiet sigh he shifted again, lifting the edge of the blankets just enough to peer toward the fire, gauging its strength by the faint orange glow reflecting off the inside of the hearth. The fire was still burning, but only barely, its flames thin and quiet, licking weakly at the logs as if struggling to keep themselves alive. He could feel in his chest, in the ache of his ribs, in the stiffness of his fingers, that if he waited too long, the cold would overwhelm the room before morning. So, slowly so as not to let the cold rush in all at once, he eased himself out of the nest, bracing for the shock he knew would come the moment his skin met the air. It hit him like a wall, a sharp, slicing cold that stole his breath and made his eyes water. But he continued, feet moving carefully across the floor, breath puffing out in thick, trembling clouds. He knelt before the fire, cupping his hands around the fading flames, coaxing them gently, whispering into the embers as though speaking to a stubborn, sleepy animal, urging it to wake. He added dry twigs first, feeding them slowly, giving the fire just enough warmth to reawaken without smothering it. Then he placed a small log at an angle, letting its edge rest against the most active part of the flame, and watched as the fire began to grow, its faint orange deepening into red, then gold, then a soft, steady glow that pushed back the cold with renewed determination. The warmth returned gradually, reaching first his hands, then his face, and then spreading outward into the room in timid waves that softened the air and eased the ache in his bones. He remained there for several moments, letting the flames gather strength before creeping back to the nest, where the family had instinctively tightened their formation in his absence. The mother shifted slightly, making room, her eyes half open, reflecting the thin firelight that flickered through the darkness. She did not speak. Words had no place in moments like this, but she reached out a hand, touching his arm briefly, a gesture that carried reassurance, gratitude, and shared resolve. With the father back in place, the nest reformed, drawing together with renewed warmth, the blankets holding in the heat more effectively now that the fire was gaining strength. The children relaxed again, their tremors easing, their breaths lengthening into slow, steady rhythms that floated softly through the room. For a few minutes, the cabin felt safer. Not warm, never warm, but safe enough to allow the thin, fragile sleep that winter permitted. Yet, even as comfort settled briefly over them, the wind outside rose again, rattling the shutters and moaning through the trees, reminding them that the night was not over, and that the cold would return the moment the fire faltered. But for now, in this small pocket of warmth, the family held firm, drifting once more into the shallow sleep that carried them through the darkest hours of winter. As the long night dragged into its final quarter, when even the insects and the distant nocturnal animals had gone still, when the cold reached a kind of oppressive perfection that seemed almost deliberate, the family entered the most fragile stage of their nightly struggle, the stage where the body, exhausted from hours of tension and shallow sleep, began to let its defenses slip. Muscles that had clenched tight for warmth loosened involuntarily, breaths grew slower and shallower, and the mind drifted into a hazy state where dreams and reality blended into one, leaving them vulnerable to the cold in ways they could not consciously resist. These were the hours when the cold tried hardest to claim space inside the cabin, seeping beneath the sleeping bodies like a rising tide, creeping upward from the floor, pooling around ankles, wrists, and the tips of ears, working its way into the smallest uncovered gaps in the blankets, like an uninvited guest slipping through a slightly open door. The children, especially, were at risk during this time. Their small bodies, which cooled faster and warmed more slowly than the adults, began to curl even tighter, their knees drawn to their chests, their hands pressed between their thighs or tucked under their chins, their faces turning toward the warmest pockets of air, as if instinct alone could guide them. The mother, though exhausted beyond words, remained half aware, her senses sharpened not by rest but by instinct and fear. She felt, more than heard, the shift in temperature, the subtle tightening in the air that signaled the fire was weakening again, and even before she opened her eyes, she sensed the icy fingers slipping beneath the blankets. She rose slowly this time, not in a rush, but with the heaviness of someone who has carried too many sleepless nights. her joints aching as she untangled herself from the nest, her breath escaping in long, pale wisps that floated toward the ceiling like drifting smoke. She crossed the cold floor with the same deliberate steps as always, each movement measured so as not to disturb the fragile warmth of the nest behind her. And when she reached the hearth, she saw the fire had dwindled into little more than a cluster of dull embers, barely alive beneath a layer of ash. The cold radiating from that corner of the cabin felt almost hostile, as though the night itself had tried to smother the last remnant of heat, and she knelt quickly, brushing away the ashes with gentle strokes, coaxing the hidden glow to reveal itself once more. Her hands trembled as she reached for the kindling, fingers stiff and clumsy from cold, and for a moment she feared that the fire might not catch, that tonight of all nights the cold might finally win. But she breathed deeply, leaning in close, whispering soft encouragements into the embers, and the faintest spark responded, a tiny flicker that glowed red for a heartbeat before fading. She tried again, holding a thin twig just above the coals, her breath steady and warm against the dying heat, and this time the ember brightened, clinging stubbornly to life. Slowly, painfully slowly, the tiniest flame took hold, spreading along the twig in a thin, wavering line that cast a faint orange glow across her face. Encouraged, she added another twig, then another, building the fire from its last fragile breath, nurturing it with the care of someone who understood that everything, her children's warmth, her husband's strength, her own survival, hung in the balance. When the flame finally rose enough to catch a small log, she let out a quiet sigh, a sound so soft it barely disturbed the air, and sat back on her heels for a moment, allowing the advancing warmth to touch her cheeks before returning to the nest. The father woke as she slipped beneath the blankets again, his hand finding hers in the darkness, gripping it gently, with gratitude that did not need words. The children shifted toward the renewed warmth, their trembling easing, their breaths deepening, their bodies slowly recovering from the cold that had begun to seep too deeply only moments before. But the danger of these hours was never fully gone. Even with the fire revived, the cold remained relentless, pressing against the walls with a determination that felt almost conscious, pushing drafts beneath the door that crawled across the floor, pooling at the foot of the bed and creeping upward. The cabin itself groaned under the pressure, the logs tightening and cracking as frost expanded inside the wood, each sound echoing through the room with a hollow finality that reminded the family how fragile their shelter truly was. Still, they endured, drifting in and out of shallow, protective sleep as the night crawled toward dawn, each breath a small victory, each minute survived a quiet triumph against a winter that showed no mercy. And then, after what always felt like an eternity suspended between shivering wakefulness and the thin edge of unconsciousness, the night began to change in ways so subtle that only those who had lived through many such winters could recognize them. The first sign was not light but a softening of the darkness itself, a faint thinning of the blackness around the window, as if the sky were reluctantly allowing the world to return. The family did not wake all at once. Rather, their bodies sensed the shift before their minds did, reacting to the slightest easing of the cold, their breaths deepening, their muscles loosening by the smallest, almost imperceptible degree. The father stirred first, not with a sudden motion, but with a slow, pained exhale, the kind of breath that escaped someone who had been clenching every muscle for hours. His eyes opened halfway, adjusting to the dimness, and he tilted his head toward the window, knowing exactly what he was looking for, that fragile suggestion of dawn peeking through the frost. A thin line of pale grey that promised the worst of the night was finally over. The fire still burned, thanks to the mother's efforts, though its warmth remained hesitant, reaching them in faint waves that barely pushed back the cold lingering around their feet. The mother awoke next, feeling the small release in the air, the way the cold had shifted from attacking to merely lingering. She lifted her head slightly, her hair stiff where frost had settled during the night, and looked toward the hearth to confirm what her instincts had already told her. The flames were still alive, though weak, and the cabin had survived its most perilous hours once again. She let her hand rest on the youngest child's back, feeling the steady rise and fall that reassured her more than any sound ever could. The children woke slowly, as if rising through layers of heavy snow, their eyelids fluttering, their faces scrunched from the stiffness left by the night. Their small bodies, curled into tight knots for so many hours, unwrapped themselves cautiously, limbs moving with that careful hesitation of people afraid the cold might strike again at any moment. Their first instinct was always the same: reach for each other, then reach for the warmth of the fire. Even before they sat up, they stretched their feet closer to the edge of the nest, seeking the faint heat beginning to drift across the floor. The cabin itself reacted to dawn in its own way. The walls, which had groaned and cracked all night under the expanding ice, now softened their sounds, settling into a quieter rhythm as the frost paused in its advance. The windows remained clouded with thick patterns of frozen breath, delicate feathers of ice glowing faintly in the growing light, and each pane seemed to hold within it the memory of every cold hour the family had survived. And then, slowly, the first true light of morning arrived, a pale silver glow that crept across the snow outside, slipped beneath the door, and touched the floorboards like a timid guest entering a sacred space. It was not warm, not yet, but it carried a promise of movement, of tasks waiting, of another day granted. The father rose carefully, pushing aside the blankets and wincing as the cold nipped at his skin. But even the sting felt different now, less aggressive, less alive, as though the night's fury had spent itself completely in the hours before dawn. He knelt by the fire one more time, adding a larger log, watching it catch with a soft whoosh that sent a welcome wave of warmth across the cabin. The fire brightened, its light growing stronger, reflecting off the children's sleepy faces, and in that moment the room felt almost alive again, breathing, shaking off the shadows of the night. The mother sat up, rubbing her hands together, her fingers tingling painfully as they regained circulation. She glanced around the cabin, the blankets damp with condensed breath, the floor dusted with frost, the air still sharp, and yet she felt a strange sense of relief, not because the cold had vanished, but because it had been endured. She whispered something soft to the children, coaxing them gently toward wakefulness, and they responded with slow smiles, their eyes still heavy but grateful. Outside, the forest remained frozen and silent, but the first birds had begun to stir in their nests, shifting, rustling, waiting for the sun. Even the animals in the lean-to beside the cabin sensed the approaching light. The goat stamped once, shaking off the frost from its fur, and the dog, curled near the hearth, thumped its tail weakly in recognition of the familiar morning rhythm. And as the dawn widened, stretching its pale brightness across the snow-covered clearing, the family began to move, slowly at first, cautiously, but with the determined purpose of people who had survived what had tried to break them. They rose from their nest, their bodies sore, their minds foggy, but their spirits anchored by the knowledge that they had endured another night in a winter that offered no mercy and no guarantees. As the morning light strengthened and began to fill the cabin with a soft, muted glow, the family slowly disentangled themselves from the heavy blankets, moving gingerly as the stiffness of the night clung stubbornly to their joints. Their bodies bear the unmistakable imprint of cold endured too long, fingers rigid and tingling as blood returned to them, legs shaky from having been curled tightly for hours, shoulders knotted from holding each other so closely that warmth could not escape. They rose one by one, not with the energetic stretch of people waking refreshed, but with the quiet determination of survivors pulling themselves back into motion after a long, frozen vigil. The father, still rubbing life back into his hands, stepped toward the window and gently scraped away a patch of frost with the back of his knuckle, revealing the bleak but familiar sight of a world buried under white. The snow outside glowed faintly in the early light, unbroken except for the narrow path he had carved the day before, and the silence lay over the clearing like a physical weight, muffling even the smallest sounds. He studied the sky for a moment, the color of the clouds, the direction of the wind, the way the treetops swayed, searching for clues about the weather. because in winters like these, even the smallest change in the air could mark the difference between endurance and catastrophe. The mother, meanwhile, stirred the pot over the fire, melting fresh snow for water, and warming what little food they had left from the day before. The steam that rose from the pot carried the faintest promise of warmth, and she leaned over it, letting the heat touch her chilled face and fingertips, closing her eyes briefly as she inhaled the comforting scent of something warm, something survivable. She moved methodically, spooning out small portions for the children, adding a bit more to the father's bowl because he would spend the day outside in the frozen air, and saving only a small bit for herself until she was sure everyone else had enough. The children gathered near the hearth, holding their stiff hands over the rising flame, watching their fingers come back to life with tiny, painful pulses of heat. Their cheeks were pale with patches of raw red from the night's cold, and their hair still carried a faint trace of frost that melted into droplets along their temples. They sat quietly at first, absorbing the warmth, blinking slowly as their minds woke fully, and then began to speak in small, sleepy murmurs about the strange dreams the cold had given them, about how bright the snow looked outside, about how soft the fire sounded this morning. The dog rose from its place near the hearth as well, stretching stiffly, its paws clicking on the floor as it shook off the last of the night's chill. It moved between the children, nuzzling their hands, instinctively understanding that their warmth was fragile and needed comforting. Even the goat, visible through the small window slits in the lean-to, stamped its hooves restlessly, waiting for the family to bring it food and clear the frost that had settled on its back. After breakfast, the father stepped outside, gripping his coat tightly around his chest as the cold pressed against him like a wall. His breath burst out in thick clouds, swirling upward before dissolving into the pale morning air, and as he walked through the snow he felt the weight of the day settle onto his shoulders. The list of tasks that could not be postponed: chopping more wood before the pile shrank dangerously low, clearing the snow from the roof before it grew too heavy, checking the traps set days earlier, in the hope of catching something small enough to add to their meals. Every step he took felt both purposeful and heavy, driven less by choice and more by the simple, unrelenting fact that life depended on constant work. Inside, the mother prepared the cabin for a new day, gathering the blankets and laying them near the fire so they could dry fully before the next night, sweeping away the thin layer of frost that had crept across the floor, shaking out the children's clothes and repairing any tears that might let cold air slip in. She did all these tasks with a kind of steady, quiet focus, her hands moving automatically, her mind fixed on the long list of things that needed doing before dusk returned, a dusk that always arrived too quickly in winter. The children ventured outside next, their boots crunching loudly in the fresh snow, their breaths bursting out like tiny puffs of smoke. They gathered kindling, brushed snow from the stored wood, fed the animals and helped carry buckets of snow inside to melt for water. Though the cold burned their cheeks and stiffened their fingers, they moved with resilience born from routine, the knowledge that each small task they completed contributed to their family's survival. As the sunlight grew stronger, casting pale beams across the clearing, the family settled into the rhythm of the day, a rhythm shaped not by comfort or leisure, but by the relentless demands of winter, where every hour carried a purpose, and every action held meaning. Nothing was wasted, nothing was taken for granted, and even the faint warmth that drifted into the cabin from the rising sun felt like a small victory, a fragile reminder that no night, no matter how long or merciless, was ever permanent. As the morning settled into its steady rhythm and the weak sunlight reached its highest point in the sky, never warm, never comforting, but at least constant, the family began to feel the familiar weight of the day pressing slowly down on them, a quiet heaviness that was not quite exhaustion and not quite despair, but something softer and deeper, like a layer of invisible snow accumulating quietly inside the mind. The cold remained everywhere, woven into the air they breathed, clinging to the walls, swirling through every crack in the cabin's structure, and even when the chores gave their bodies purpose, The air itself seemed to resist every movement, making even simple tasks feel like wading through frozen water. The father continued chopping wood, each strike of the axe echoing through the clearing with a dull, muted thud that drifted upward into the still air, the sound carrying a strange rhythm that blended with the distant creaking of ice-laden branches. His muscles burned from effort, but he knew the work could not stop. Wood was their single greatest treasure in winters like these, more valuable than food on some days, more essential than sleep, and every log he split added another few hours of protection to the long night that would surely come again. The motion kept him warm, though only barely, and as he paused between swings, he could see his breath streaming out in thick, twisting ribbons that disappeared almost instantly. Inside the cabin, the mother tended to the slow, quiet work that kept the family grounded. She washed the children's faces with warm water, rubbing their cold reddened cheeks until the blood returned in blotchy pink clouds. She checked their fingers and toes for early signs of frostbite, pressing gently to make sure the flesh responded as it should. She spread the blankets near the fire, turning them over to chase away the dampness from the night, and she kept an eye on the food, a task that brought with it a constant anxiety, because winter meals were measured in handfuls, not servings, and every decision about what to cook, what to save, and what to ration carried the weight of days or even weeks ahead. By midday, the children had completed their small chores outside and returned inside to warm themselves, their boots leaving wet trails across the floor as the snow melted on contact with the slightly warmer cabin air. They sat near the hearth, eating the small midday meal their mother served, warm but thin, a broth stretched with melted snow, and the last scraps of whatever root vegetables remained. Still, the warmth filled their chests, spreading slowly through their bodies like a tiny fire of their own, and for a few minutes they relaxed, shoulders dropping, breathing easier, their young faces softening in the flickering light. Yet, even in this brief reprieve, the cold maintained its quiet presence, seeping through the walls and settling into the corners of the room, waiting. It was a constant companion, not violent during daylight, not aggressive as in the night, but persistent and steady, a reminder that they were never more than a few hours away from darkness and its deeper dangers. The family felt it not just on their skin, but in their bones, in their thoughts, in the way they moved, slower and more carefully with each passing day, as though their bodies were conserving whatever strength remained for the nights to come. The father eventually returned inside, his hands red and raw beneath his gloves, his breath heavy from the weight of work, and he warmed himself briefly by the fire before turning to inspect the cabin structure. He ran his fingers along the chinking, feeling for gaps widened by the morning's brittle cold, packing in more moss or clay wherever the draft slipped through too easily. He checked the door, pushing a bit of snow against its base to reinforce the makeshift barrier they had created. He placed the freshly split wood in careful stacks near the hearth, planning exactly how many logs would be needed through the next night, calculating the hours as someone who had lived this rhythm year after year. Outside, the forest remained silent, the trees standing frozen and unmoving, their branches heavy with ice that shimmered faintly in the weak winter sun. The sky, though brighter than at dawn, carried a muted grey tone that hinted at another snowfall coming soon, a thin veil of cloud stretching across the horizon that experienced farmers learned to read with a kind of instinctive dread, and though the children played quietly near the hearth, tracing shapes in the frost on the window, or rolling small balls of discarded wool between their fingers, even they could sense the heaviness in the air, the slow tightening that marked the approach of evening. As the day reached its midpoint, the family resumed their chores with a renewed urgency, because they knew how quickly the afternoon would slip away, how rapidly the shadows would lengthen, and the air would sharpen into the first sting of night. Every hour after midday mattered. Every minute needed to be used with purpose, repairing clothing, boiling water, feeding the animals, clearing snow from the cabin roof, checking the traps in the forest, gathering the last bits of kindling that might be usable before everything froze solid again. And throughout it all, The unspoken understanding hung in the air like a thin layer of frost. No matter how many tasks they completed, no matter how carefully they prepared, the winter always demanded more, always tested the limits of their endurance, always reminded them that the margin between surviving and succumbing was measured not in abundance but in small acts of persistence repeated over and over, day after day, night after night. As the afternoon slowly unfolded, the daylight thinning almost imperceptibly at first, the family began to feel the familiar tightening of time, that subtle but unmistakable shift in the air that signaled the world was already preparing itself for night. Even if the sun still lingered weakly above the tree line, shadows lengthened across the snow outside, stretching like dark fingers over the white fields, and the sky took on a pale, washed-out hue, a kind of tired grey that seemed to flatten the landscape and mute every colour, as though winter were slowly turning the world into a single silent canvas. The father sensed it immediately. He straightened from stacking the fresh wood and took a long measured breath, feeling the temperature drop even before the wind picked up. His bones, worn from years of winters just like this one, reacted instinctively, a kind of internal clock that told him how long they had before dusk, how quickly they needed to move if they wanted to avoid being caught unprepared. He stepped outside for one last round of tasks, the cold greeting him with a sharp bite that stung his cheeks and made the air feel heavy in his lungs. He checked the forest edge for signs of incoming weather, studied the movement of the clouds, and noted the way the branches swayed almost imperceptibly, small signs that the night ahead would be harsher than the one before. Inside the cabin, the mother gathered the children close and began organizing their clothing layers, inspecting each piece with tired but careful hands. She tightened bindings, added small strips of cloth to gaps that had stretched with use, and smoothed woolen caps over their heads, pressing the fabric down over ears still red from the cold. Her movements were precise and methodical, born from endless repetition, but beneath the routine lay a quiet urgency, a silent acknowledgement that every bit of preparation might mean the difference between a manageable night and a dangerous one. The children, though young, sensed the shift too. Their voices softened, their play slowed, and their eyes wandered repeatedly toward the shuttered window where the light was fading. They moved with a kind of instinctive caution now, gathering the furs and blankets, arranging them in the sleeping space near the hearth, fluffing the worn hides, making sure no edge of fabric was left twisted or thin. Even the youngest child understood that warmth had to be built like a fortress, layered, tucked, sealed, and that any gap, no matter how small, could become a doorway for the cold. The mother prepared the evening meal, stirring the pot with slow, circular motions, watching the thin broth bubble gently as it absorbed the faint heat of the fire. The scent that rose from it, modest, earthy, simple, filled the cabin with a fragile sense of comfort, and she let herself savor it for a moment. Cooking during winter felt less like preparing food and more like tending a flame within the family itself, nurturing a warmth that needed constant attention to survive. She ladled the small portions into wooden bowls and set them carefully around the hearth, spacing them evenly so the children could warm their hands as they ate. Back outside, the father gathered the last of the kindling he had split earlier and brushed the snow from the woodpile, shaking his hands to keep feeling from fading as the cold pushed deeper into his fingers. He made one final loop around the cabin, checking the walls, adjusting the hide that hung over the door, and pressing additional snow against the foundation to block any new drafts. These small rituals, repeated every day of the winter, formed a shield made not of strength but of attention, a collection of tiny acts that kept the cold at bay just long enough for the rest of the world to wake again. As he stepped back inside, the warmth from the fire washed over him like a soft, fleeting embrace, and he closed the door with a quiet firmness, sealing out the wind for as long as the night would allow. The family gathered for their meal, leaning toward the fire, hands wrapped around the warm wooden bowls, steam drifting upward in pale ribbons that caught the orange glow of the flames. They ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, not because it was filling, it rarely was, but because warm food was one of the few comforts the winter allowed. After the meal, the family worked together to prepare the sleeping area more thoroughly, the father adding another heavy hide to block the draft near the floor, the mother tucking the corners of the blankets deeper beneath the bed frame, the children arranging themselves into their usual positions within the nest. The fire was fed again, this time with thicker logs meant to burn slowly through the early hours of the night, casting a warm glow that shimmered against the rough cabin walls. And then, as the sun finally slipped below the tree line, leaving only a dusky, bruised light behind it, the familiar weight of evening settled once more over the family, wrapping itself around them with the cold promise of another long night. The work of the day was done, the small rituals completed, the preparations finalized. All that remained was to surrender themselves again to the fragile warmth they had built, to hold on to each other in the darkness, and to trust that the fire and their own endurance would be enough. As the last strands of daylight finally dissolved into the thickening twilight, the cabin shifted once again into that solemn, almost ceremonial transition between day and night, a period that felt far longer than it truly was, because every member of the family sensed what it meant, that they were stepping into another cycle of waiting, watching, enduring, and hoping. The temperature dropped quickly now, falling with a sharpness that made the air itself seem heavier, a cold so dense it pressed into the cabin with the weight of something alive, something patient, something determined to reclaim the space the fire had stolen from it during the day. The father felt it first, not on his skin, but in his bones, in the way the air chilled deeper inside his chest with each breath, a tightness spreading from his ribs outward, as though winter itself were slowly coiling around him. He added another log to the fire, this one larger, carefully positioned so it would catch slowly and burn through the earliest hours of darkness. The flames licked upward, casting warm, uneven light across the wooden walls, revealing for a moment the patterns left by years of smoke and frost, the small cracks filled with hand-packed moss, the edges of the door frame darkened by countless nights just like this. The mother guided the children into the winter nest they had arranged earlier, smoothing the blankets, tucking the hides more snugly around their shoulders, adjusting their layers with gentle, practiced hands that knew without asking where cold could sneak in. The children instinctively curled toward each other, forming the tight cluster of warmth they had perfected over many nights, their faces already turning toward the fire, their eyes heavy from the long day of work and cold that clung to their limbs like invisible chains. Even the animals reacted to the coming night. The dog padded closer to the hearth, laying its head on its paws with a soft, resigned sigh, while the goat shifted restlessly in the lean-to, bumping against the wooden structure, as if trying to find a spot where the wind could not reach it. The forest outside grew unnaturally still, the wind momentarily dying down to a whisper, as though nature itself were holding its breath in anticipation of the cold strike that would follow. Inside, the cabin's air cooled visibly. Their breath turned to thick, lingering clouds, drifting upward in soft plumes that twisted into the rafters. The walls emitted tiny, brittle pops as the wood contracted under the advancing frost, each sound a reminder of the structure's vulnerability, of the unspoken truth that the cabin survived each night only because its inhabitants tended it with relentless care. The father finally settled into the nest, lying on the edge closest to the drafty wall, his back braced against the cold that seeped through even the thickest layer of chinking. He let out a slow, controlled exhale, speaking no words but signaling to the mother with a faint nod that the preparations were complete. She joined him shortly after, sliding into the space they had carved for her between the children, her body radiating the same tired warmth that held the nest together. As the fire crackled and cast flickering shadows along the ceiling beams, the first low gust of nighttime wind returned, brushing against the cabin's outer wall with a muted thud that made the children sink deeper into the blankets. The sound was familiar, predictable, even, yet it always carried a quiet bite of tension, a reminder that the night was not simply darkness, but a force that tested their resolve with every hour it held them captive. The mother whispered something soft, almost inaudible. A simple reassurance, perhaps a prayer, perhaps just the sound of a breath, meant to comfort the youngest child whose small fingers clung instinctively to hers. The father rested one hand near the edge of the nest, ready to rise again when the fire dimmed, his body trained by years of necessity to sense changes in temperature even while half asleep. And slowly, as the fire settled into a steady rhythm and the night outside deepened into its full icy darkness, the family began to drift into the fragile, vigilant sleep that winter allowed, a sleep made of moments of shallow breaths, of bodies pressed tightly together, of warmth shared in silence, of the unspoken understanding that they would face whatever the night brought, not as individuals, but as one. Outside, the cold advanced again, pushing against the door, weaving through the cracks, searching for places where warmth had thinned, but inside the fire still glowed, inside the family still held on, inside a tiny island of human strength endured within a sea of frozen wilderness. As the night deepened and the darkness outside grew so complete that it seemed to press against the tiny windows like a living thing, the cold returned with a renewed intensity, slipping back across the frozen land in long, sweeping currents that wrapped themselves around the cabin, as though trying to smother the small pocket of warmth glowing within. The flames in the hearth, steady just moments earlier, began to flicker in response to subtle changes in the air, stretching and bending like thin orange fingers grasping for more fuel, and the room itself seemed to tighten with each gust of wind scraping against the outer walls. Inside the nest, the family lay curled in the same instinctive positions they had learned night after night, knees drawn up, arms wrapped close, bodies pressed tightly together in a cluster that formed not out of comfort, out of necessity. The first signs that midnight was approaching came quietly, a subtle change in the quality of the air, a faint sting that crept across the uncovered parts of their faces, a tightening in their muscles as their bodies responded to the temperature drop before their minds fully registered it. Even in sleep, their nerves recognized the cold's return, sending small spasms through their limbs, tiny shivers that rippled through the nest like waves. The father stirred first, not waking fully but shifting uneasily, his shoulders twitching as the draft from the wall seeped beneath the blankets and crawled across his back. He pulled the hides closer around his body, but the cold had already begun its slow advance, slipping through the tiny imperfections in the chinking gathering near the floor, in a silent pool of frigid air that rose inch by inch. His breath emerged in long, unsteady trails of mist, drifting into the darkness above his head before fading away. The mother felt it next, her fingertips tingling painfully as the blood retreated from the extremities to protect her core. She moved closer to the children, draping an additional fold of blanket over them, smoothing the fur along their shoulders, pressing her own warmth into their bodies, as if shielding them with her very presence. She did not speak. Words had little power in these hours, but her touch carried a quiet reassurance, a silent promise that she was awake, vigilant, ready to rise when needed. The children began to tremble lightly, their small breaths quickening into soft, rapid puffs that fogged the air around their faces. Their dreams, shaped by the cold, turned uneasy. Their bodies curled tighter, searching instinctively for warmth in the familiar spaces between each other and their parents. Their chests rose and fell in uneven rhythms, sometimes hitching when the cold stabbed too sharply at their skin, causing them to whimper softly before sinking back into half-conscious sleep. By now the fire had weakened, its flames shrinking into a faint cluster of golden embers that glowed stubbornly, but without strength. The shadows in the cabin lengthened, swallowing the corners of the room, and leaving only the dim outline of the hearth to guide the father's waking mind. He opened his eyes fully now, sensing that the fire was dangerously low, and lowered himself from the nest with slow, deliberate movements, careful not to let the cold rush beneath the blankets and steal the fragile warmth his family had gathered. The moment his feet touched the floor, the cold surged upward, biting into his skin with a sharp, breath-stealing force that made his entire body shudder. His breath hitched, forming a cloud so thick it seemed to hang in the air for several seconds before dissipating. But he kept moving, knees stiff, joints aching, leaning toward the hearth as though pulled forward by instinct alone. He knelt before the embers, hands cupped around them, blowing gently to coax them back to life. His breath warmed the coals, stirring the faintest glimmer of red into a brighter, pulsing glow, and he reached for the thinnest pieces of kindling, placing them carefully across the fragile embers with the same tenderness he would have used to cradle a newborn. At first, nothing happened. The fire hesitated, reluctant, as if weighing the effort of returning. Then, after several moments of coaxing, a thin ribbon of flame unfurled along the edge of a twig, curling upward in a trembling arc before catching fully. He added another piece. Then a small log, working with the precision of someone who had done this countless times, someone who understood that rushing could smother the fire entirely. As the flames grew, the cabin brightened once more with the warm, uneven glow that had become their nightly lifeline, pushing back the cold in slow, tender waves. Only when the fire was steady again did he return to the nest, his body already shaking from the brief exposure. The mother opened a small space for him, pulling the blankets back over his shoulders as he slid beneath them, absorbing the warmth that radiated from her and the children. His breathing slowed gradually, settling into the same shallow rhythm as the rest of the family. But sleep did not come immediately. He remained half awake, half listening to the sounds of the cabin, the crackle of the fire regaining its strength, the faint moans of the wind circling outside, the soft, unsteady breaths of the children nestled beside him. He knew the cold would return again before dawn, stronger each time, and that his body would need to rise once more to protect the fragile warmth they fought to maintain. Still, in this moment, as the nest regained its heat and the fire glowed steadily, there was a sense of fragile peace, a brief reprieve in which the family rested together, protected not by walls or by fortune, but by their persistence, their vigilance, and the small, stubborn flame that refused to die. As the night crept into its final and most merciless stretch, the hours just before dawn gathered around the cabin like a tightening fist, squeezing the last remnants of warmth out of the air and pressing the cold deeper into the bones of everyone within. In winters like that of 1712, these hours were spoken of in hushed tones, even by the strongest families, the wolf hours they called them, a time when exhaustion clawed at the edges of the mind, when the fire seemed to burn too low no matter how carefully it had been fed, and when the cold, sensing fatigue, grew bolder, hungrier, touching everything it had been denied earlier in the night. Inside the nest, the family's bodies reacted almost simultaneously to this deepening freeze. The children shivered first, small involuntary tremors rolling through their limbs like trembling waves, their breaths shortening into quick, fragile puffs that looked almost silvery in the dim firelight, their knees pulled tighter to their chests, their arms wrapped instinctively around their bodies, and their faces turned inward toward the faint warmth radiating from the group's center. Even in sleep, their bodies curled deeper into the shape humans assume only when fighting for warmth, a shape older than memory, older than language, carved into human instinct by centuries of winter nights just like this. The mother felt the change next. Her fingertips, once warmed by tending the fire earlier, now ached sharply as the cold reclaimed them, a stinging numbness spreading slowly across her knuckles and into her palms. Her breath came slower, heavier, each exhale leaving a trail of mist that lingered too long before dissolving. She drew closer to the children, pulling the hides tighter over them, smoothing the blankets with one hand while the other pressed gently against the youngest child's back, feeling the soft rise and fall of their breath with a mother's dread-tinged vigilance. Even her heartbeat felt slower, as though winter were trying to lull her into a dangerous stillness. The father lay awake, though his eyes were closed, his body fully aware that the worst cold of the night was descending. His skin prickled as icy air crept beneath the layers of blankets, gathering like a deathly pool at the floor and rising upward in slow, steady waves. His breath felt thin in his chest, and each inhale sent a chill through his ribs, as if the cold were trying to settle inside him. He knew that soon he would have to rise again, not because he wanted to, but because the fire, despite his earlier efforts, was beginning to falter under the relentless pressure of the night. Outside, the wind rose to a haunting, almost mournful tone, weaving through the trees with a brittle whisper that sounded like something alive and restless. Snow shifted in faint waves across the frozen ground, brushing softly against the walls of the cabin with a dry, crystalline hiss. Each gust made the structure tremble ever so slightly, the timbers groaning under the cold's tightening grip. And those sounds, so familiar and yet endlessly unsettling, seeped into the family's half-conscious minds, whispering that the night still held dominion. The fire dimmed further, the once bold flames withdrawing into a smaller, trembling glow that flickered nervously along the edges of the logs. Shadows gathered around the hearth, lengthening, merging, swallowing the corners of the cabin, until the entire room seemed to shrink into a small, wavering pocket of barely surviving light. The father knew what this meant. He felt it in the sudden sharpness of the cold creeping along his feet, in the way the air grew heavy and still, in the faint sensory warning that had awakened him countless times before. He opened his eyes and forced himself to rise from the nest, moving slowly so as not to disturb the fragile warmth his family had gathered. The cold met him instantly, a swift and merciless slap that stole his breath and made his skin contract painfully. His joints cracked quietly as he crawled toward the hearth, his fingers stiff as he reached out to test the embers, barely warm beneath the delicate layer of ash. For a moment he paused, swallowing hard, feeling the weight of exhaustion pressing heavily on his shoulders, the kind of fatigue that whispered temptations he dared not listen to, the dangerous hint that maybe, just maybe, he could lie back down for a minute before tending the fire. But he did not. He leaned forward and began coaxing the embers with the stubborn determination of someone who knew this cold could not be allowed even a moment of advantage. He blew gently, warming the coals with his breath, and added the smallest slivers of wood, thin, dry pieces meant to awaken the fire without smothering it. The flames answered slowly, a hesitant flicker at first, then a slightly stronger glow, trembling but resolute, rising upward like something being pulled back from the edge of death. He stayed there until he was certain the flames would hold. Only then did he return to the nest, body shaking, face stinging, breath unsteady from the brief exposure. The mother shifted to make space for him, their bodies aligning instinctively as the children drew closer, reacting to the renewed warmth with soft, relieved murmurs. Yet even with the fire rekindled, the cold remained a heavy presence, lingering like a shadow too dense to disperse fully. The family drifted into another layer of shallow sleep, one eye always open in the back of the mind, as if their bodies understood that dawn was near but not yet promised. And outside, just beyond the walls, the cold clung fiercely to the land, knowing it had only one more hour to claim what warmth it could before the first faint light of morning broke its grip. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the first signs of dawn began to form far beyond the frozen horizon, and though no light had yet touched the cabin, something in the air itself began to shift, a loosening of the cold's suffocating grip, a faint and nearly imperceptible softening that only those who had endured countless winter nights could recognize. It was not warmth, not even close, but rather the promise of warmth, the suggestion that the deepest darkness had passed and that the sky, still hidden behind blackness, was preparing to lift its heavy veil at last. Inside the nest, the family's bodies sensed the change before their minds did. The shivering eased by the smallest margin, the trembling breaths grew a fraction steadier, and their muscles, which had been clenched tight for hours, relaxed just enough to release a soft groan from one of the children as they shifted in their sleep. The mother, half awake, felt the change like a whisper against her skin. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the dim, flickering light of the fire, and she turned her head toward the window, watching the dark square of shuttered wood for any sign of the grey light she knew must be approaching. The father stirred too, not abruptly, but with the slow, deliberate movements of someone who had spent the entire night on the edge of exhaustion. He blinked a few times, trying to focus his tired eyes, and let out a long breath that drifted into the air as a lingering cloud of mist, hanging there for a moment before fading. He listened carefully, not for danger, but for stillness. A stillness that told him the worst of the night's winds had passed, that the world outside had settled into a quieter, less violent cold. He lifted the blanket slightly, testing the air with his hand, and felt the slightest difference, still freezing, still able to cut through bone, but lacking the sharp, predatory bite it had carried only an hour earlier. It was enough. Enough to tell him that dawn was near, enough to tell him they had survived the most perilous stretch of night once again. The fire, revived earlier with such effort, was now burning weakly but steadily, its flames moving with a gentle sway that brought a delicate warmth to the nearest faces in the nest. The children instinctively leaned toward it, their cold, flushed cheeks glowing faintly in the dim orange light, the brittle frost that had collected along their eyelashes beginning to melt into tiny droplets. Their breathing grew deeper, calmer, their bodies curling slightly less tightly, the instinctive posture of desperation easing into one of cautious rest. Outside, the cold still ruled the land, but the forest gave subtle hints that dawn was approaching. Far in the distance, a single crack echoed, the sound of a tree splitting under the night's pressure, followed by long silence, and then the faint rustling of some small creature moving beneath the snow, testing whether the morning had truly begun. The wind, which had howled with such force just hours earlier, now drifted lazily through the treetops, barely more than a sigh. The world was not warm, but it was no longer entirely hostile. And then, as if the sky took one long breath before speaking, the first faint glow began to appear beyond the horizon, not visible through the cabin's shutters, but felt, a thin, cold silver that slowly pushed against the edges of the darkness, causing the air inside the cabin to brighten by imperceptible degrees. The mother saw it first, a faint change in the shadows along the far wall, a slight softening of the cabin's outline. She placed a gentle hand on the father's arm, not to wake him. He was already awake, but to acknowledge that the long night was finally loosening its claws. He nodded softly, then pushed himself up, groaning as stiff muscles protested the movement. He wrapped a blanket around his shoulders for a moment, savoring the little warmth it held, before rising carefully to tend the fire again. He added another piece of wood, one of the thicker ones they had saved for dawn, and watched as the flames caught, flaring brighter, spreading light across the cabin, in soft bursts that illuminated the children's sleeping faces. The warmth washed across the room like a blessing. The mother gently shook the children, coaxing them awake not with urgency, but with the tender patience of someone who knew how fragile their bodies were after such a night. They blinked groggily, rubbing their eyes with stiff hands, and the sight of the fire, alive again, stronger, drew faint smiles to their lips, small but unmistakable. As the dawn glow finally seeped into the cracks around the shutters, illuminating the frost in pale silver, the family sat up together, wrapped in blankets, breathing deeply the cold morning air that somehow felt softer than the night's bitter edge. They were exhausted, their bodies sore and aching, but they were alive, and in the winter of 1712, that was not a small achievement but a quiet triumph earned through vigilance, resilience, and the stubborn refusal to surrender to the cold. Outside, the sky slowly turned from black to grey, then to the faintest, coldest shade of blue, signalling the beginning of another day of work, of scarcity, of struggle, but also another day of survival. As the first fragile light of morning finally broke across the clearing, the family rose slowly from their nest, stretching stiff limbs and rubbing the cold from their faces, their bodies heavy with the weight of a night that had demanded everything from them, and yet had left them just enough strength to begin again. The father stepped outside first, pushing open the door with a quiet determination, letting the silver-blue dawn spill across the threshold in a muted glow that made the snow sparkle like powdered glass. The air that met him was still cold, still razor-sharp, but it no longer carried the predatory intent of night. It felt instead like something worn out, softened, humbled by the coming of the day. He stood for a moment, breathing deeply, watching the faint steam rise from the barn where the goat shuffled its hooves, seeing the dog trot out into the snow to stretch its legs, and he allowed himself a rare, quiet moment of gratitude. Not for ease, not for comfort, but simply for the chance to keep going. Behind him, the mother guided the children through the first movements of morning, warming their hands by the fire, smoothing their hair, helping them slip back into their outer layers with gentle patience that spoke of love far stronger than fear. The cabin, still bearing the scars of the night, the thin frost along the floorboards, the faint crackle of wood contracting as the air shifted, the smell of smoke clinging to every surface, slowly came back to life. The fire brightened beneath the mother's careful tending, filling the room with a soft glow that carried a promise that warmth, however fragile, however fleeting, could always be rebuilt with enough care. The children's voices, hushed and sleepy, rose softly as they moved about, their breaths turning to mist in the cool air, small, innocent reminders that even in a season ruled by hardship, life persisted in quiet, stubborn ways. As the family gathered for their modest breakfast, the world beyond the window shifted into clearer focus. The sky grew brighter, the outlines of the trees sharpened, and the faint cries of distant birds carried through the still air, announcing that another day had begun its slow, patient climb toward dusk. It was not a day promised to be easy. None of them were, but it was a day, and in the winter of 1712, each day was a victory made possible only by the persistence of the night before. And so, with bowls of warm broth between their hands, with blankets still wrapped around their shoulders, with eyes that carried both exhaustion and resilience, the family began to speak in low, gentle tones about the tasks ahead, the wood that needed splitting, the animals that needed feeding, the repairs the cabin required before the next night came creeping in. Their voices mingled with the soft crackle of the fire, forming a kind of morning lullaby, a quiet acknowledgement that while winter ruled the land, they ruled the space within these walls through courage, routine, and the fierce tenderness of their shared survival. Outside, the sun finally broke fully over the horizon, casting long golden beams across the snow, melting the edges of frost that clung desperately to the cabin roof, and illuminating the world with a light that, though cold, still carried hope. The father stepped toward the doorway, preparing for the unending labor of the day, and the mother gathered the children near the fire for one last moment of warmth before sending them into the pale morning air. And as they stepped once more into the rhythm of survival, the chopping, the tending, the gathering, the mending, they did so with the quiet collective knowledge that they would face another night soon enough, another trial of cold and darkness. But they also carried with them the memory of this dawn, the proof that no matter how harsh the winter, no matter how long the night, morning always returned, slowly, gently, inevitably. And in that gentle return of light, they found the strength to endure again.